There is a very specific reason why experienced park rangers enforce those strict backcountry curfew hours, and it has nothing to do with bears or getting lost in the dark. If you catch one of them off duty, buying them a cheap beer at a local dive bar just outside the tree line, they might actually tell you the truth. They sign non-disclosure agreements the size of a phone book before they ever put on that green uniform, swearing to keep their mouths shut about the things they pull out of the deep timber. The official reports always say exposure, or animal attacks, or a tragic hiking accident when a solo camper goes missing. But the rangers who actually hike into the brush to recover those torn-up tents know exactly what happens when you decide to sleep alone under that massive, unbroken canopy. We all crave that romanticized idea of ultimate isolation, packing a single bag and driving out until our cell service completely drops off the map. You think you are finding yourself in the quiet, disconnecting from the noise of the city to breathe real, untainted air for the first time in years. What you do not realize is that the quiet out there is not empty, but rather heavy, watchful, and intensely aware of your sudden intrusion. By the time the sun fully dips below the jagged horizon, leaving you with nothing but a dying flashlight and a thin nylon wall, you are no longer a guest in nature. You are simply the only warm, breathing thing left in a space that belonged to something else long before the first trees even grew. Elias was exactly the kind of guy who thought he understood the woods better than the people paid to protect them. He drove his battered Subaru up the winding logging roads of the Pacific Northwest, pushing past the designated tourist trails to find a spot entirely off the grid. The air up there was thick with the scent of damp pine needles and rotting wood, clinging to his clothes the second he stepped out of the car. He had spent 3 agonizing weeks trapped in a suffocating cubicle in Seattle, and this weekend was supposed to be his ultimate reset button. He threw his heavy canvas pack over his shoulder, locking the car doors out of pure city habit, even though there was not another human being for 50 miles. The hike in was grueling but beautiful, the kind of untouched wilderness that makes you forget every mundane problem you left behind in the concrete sprawl. Tall, ancient Douglas firs stretched up like dark pillars holding up a gray, overcast sky, their branches filtering the sunlight into pale, dusty shafts. Elias found a perfect flat clearing near a slow-moving creek by late afternoon, feeling a deep surge of pride as he unrolled his expensive one-man tent. He spent an hour gathering dry kindling, stacking it neatly near a fire ring built from river stones that looked untouched by anyone else for decades. He sat back on a damp log, cracking open a warm bottle of water, and let the profound, absolute silence of the deep forest wash over him. That silence, however, was his very first mistake, though he would not understand why until much later into the terrifying night. True wilderness is never actually quiet. It is a constant humming ecosystem of birds, insects, rustling leaves, and small animals foraging in the dense brush. But right as the last sliver of daylight vanished, every single ambient noise around his small campsite simply ceased to exist. It was not a gradual fading out of nature, but a sudden, violent mute button pressed down on the entire forest in unison. Elias barely noticed it at first, too busy trying to get his stubborn campfire to catch on to the damp bark of the surrounding twigs. Down at the ranger station at the base of the mountain, a seasoned veteran named Miller was already marking Elias's trail on a weathered topographic map. Miller had seen the Seattle plates on the Subaru hours ago, noting the single occupant and the heavy, solo camping gear strapped to the roof rack. He did not drive up to stop him, nor did he issue any of the mandatory warnings about the sudden drop in temperature or the unstable terrain. Instead, Miller just dragged a thick red marker across the grid square where Elias was currently struggling with his fire, filing the paperwork away in a locked metal drawer. The veteran ranger poured himself a cup of stale black coffee, knowing the unwritten rule of the valley was to let the mountain take what it was owed. Back at the clearing, the fire finally sparked to life, throwing dancing orange shadows against the towering walls of bark that completely surrounded Elias. He cooked a simple meal over the modest flames, the smell of salted meat and wood smoke giving him a false, comforting sense of absolute security. The complete absence of wildlife noise still did not register in his mind as a threat, passing it off as just the natural settling of the nocturnal woods. He wrapped his thick wool blanket tightly around his shoulders, staring into the burning embers, feeling completely detached from the chaotic world he had left behind. He genuinely believed he was the master of this tiny, illuminated circle of dirt, utterly blind to the deep darkness pressing tightly against the edges of the light. A sudden, sharp crack of a heavy branch snapping broke the unnatural stillness, echoing loudly from somewhere just beyond the creek. Elias jumped slightly, his heart doing a quick, involuntary stutter, but he quickly forced a nervous laugh and blamed it on a wandering deer. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight and swept the beam across the water, illuminating nothing but mossy rocks and the twisted, pale roots of dead trees. The light cut through the gloom like a knife, but the shadows behind the trees seemed to swallow the beam entirely, revealing no reflective animal eyes. He turned the flashlight off to preserve the battery, convincing himself it was time to crawl into his sleeping bag and call it a successful first night. Crawling into a tent in the absolute dark feels less like seeking shelter and more like zipping yourself into a sensory deprivation bag. Elias lay flat on his back inside his sleeping bag, staring up at the thin fabric roof that separated him from the crushing weight of the forest. The fire outside was dying down, casting weak, flickering silhouettes against the nylon walls that looked a little too much like reaching fingers. That was when the heavy, rhythmic thumping started, vibrating through the cold dirt directly beneath his foam sleeping pad. It was not the erratic, skittish pattern of an animal looking for food, but rather the deliberate, heavy tread of something walking on two legs. Whatever it was pacing slowly in a perfect, unbroken circle around the perimeter of his campsite, testing the boundaries of the fading light. Elias held his breath, his hands gripping the freezing zipper of his sleeping bag, paralyzed by the sudden realization that he was being hunted. The heavy footsteps dragged on for what felt like hours, crunching dried pine needles with a slow, agonizing deliberation that defied all natural logic. Suddenly, the pacing stopped dead right near the extinguished fire ring, leaving Elias in a suffocating, unbearable pocket of absolute silence. He strained his ears in the dark, desperately hoping to hear a bear grunt or a coyote yip, something to ground him back in reality. Instead, a voice drifted through the thin fabric of his tent, but it was completely stripped of any human warmth or natural cadence. It sounded exactly like his own voice, mimicking the soft, nervous laugh he had forced out earlier by the creek, down to the exact pitch. The hollow imitation repeated itself over and over, looping like a broken cassette tape right outside the fragile zipper of his front flap. A deep, primal terror flooded his veins, locking every muscle in his body as the copied laughter slowly morphed into a wet, guttural breathing. The thing outside shifted its weight, and a massive, heavy pressure pressed down against the top of the tent, causing the aluminum poles to groan. Elias watched in absolute horror as the fabric bowed inward, stretching tight around the shape of something impossibly large, leaning directly over his face. There were no distinct hands or claws visible in the depression, just a massive, blunt mass of weight that radiated an intense, freezing cold. The smell hit him a second later, a vile, overwhelming stench of ozone and old, stagnant water that made his eyes water profusely. It dragged itself slowly across the roof of the tent, the rough texture of whatever covered its body making a sickening, scraping noise against the nylon. He squeezed his eyes shut, blindly reaching out for the heavy steel flashlight he had left near the foot of his sleeping bag. If the fabric gave way, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not survive whatever was waiting for him on the other side. Down in the valley, Ranger Miller was pouring his third cup of coffee, staring blankly at the radio console that he had intentionally switched off. He knew the exact topography of where Elias had pitched his tent, and he knew precisely what time the shadows in that sector stopped obeying the sun. It was a sick, unspoken agreement between the local forestry department and the mountain itself, a toll paid in blood to keep the lower trails safe. As long as the woods took one overconfident out-of-towner every few months, the tourist paths around the lake remained completely untouched by the nightmare. Miller reached into his drawer and pulled out a stack of non-disclosure agreements, his eyes skimming over the heavy black redactions covering the older incident reports. He had seen the aftermath of these nights too many times, the shredded nylon, and the empty boots left perfectly tied on the forest floor. He just turned the volume knob on his small desk television up a little higher, drowning out any phantom noises that might drift down the mountain. Back in the suffocating darkness of the clearing, Elias realized the heavy scraping against his tent had completely stopped, leaving that heavy silence again. He slowly clicked on his flashlight, pointing the beam at the roof, but the massive indentation was gone, leaving the fabric hanging loosely in the cold. He foolishly let out a ragged gasp of relief, thinking the nightmare had passed and the massive thing had finally lost interest in him. That relief shattered instantly when the thick metal zipper of the tent door began to slide upward, moving with a painfully slow, deliberate mechanical click. The bottom corner of the nylon flap peeled back, letting in a rush of freezing air and revealing a jagged sliver of pitch-black woods. Elias scrambled backward, pressing his spine painfully against the rear mesh of the tent, his finger trembling violently over the flashlight switch. Something was sliding into the tent with him, moving completely without sound, and the overwhelming smell of old water instantly filled the enclosed space. If you are listening to this right now and planning to pack up your car for a solo trip into the deep tree line, you need to stop. The romantic fantasy of sleeping totally alone under the canopy is exactly how they find you when you are completely isolated from help. Before you ever drive past a ranger station, I need you to pause this and go directly to the pinned comment below this video. I have left a highly specific list of coordinates and unlisted trail markers that the Forestry Department officially claims do not even exist. You must memorize the exact color of the blazes detailed in that comment, because following the wrong painted tree will lead you off the map entirely. Read the survival protocols carefully before you take another step into the brush, because out there, screaming for help only tells it exactly where you are. Once you know the signs to look for, you will understand why the locals never stay out past dusk. Elias did not wait to see what was pulling itself through that open zipper. Pure, blinding adrenaline hijacked his nervous system, stripping away every rational thought he had left in his freezing brain. He threw his heavy flashlight directly at the opening, hearing a sickening, wet thud that sounded like metal striking damp clay. Without missing a beat, he drove his pocket knife blindly through the back wall of the tent, ripping a massive hole in the expensive nylon. He squeezed his shoulders through the jagged tear, tearing his thick wool sweater on the broken fiberglass poles as he thrashed backward. The freezing night air hit his sweating face like a brick wall, but he did not stop moving. He scrambled on his hands and knees over the jagged river stones, leaving his car keys, his phone, and his entire life behind in the dirt. The forest outside the tent was a completely different world than the one he had hiked through earlier that afternoon. The tall, comforting trees were now just massive, jagged walls of black shadow pressing in from every single direction. Elias scrambled up the muddy embankment of the creek, his boots slipping heavily on the slick, rotting moss covering the rocks. He could hear the heavy, tearing sound of his tent collapsing completely behind him, followed by a low, vibrating hum that rattled his teeth. It was not chasing him with the frantic, snapping energy of a wild predator, but with a slow, terrifying confidence. It knew perfectly well that there was nowhere for him to run in this pitch-black, freezing labyrinth of dead wood. Every time he stumbled over a hidden root, he heard his own voice echoing from the darkness behind him, perfectly mimicking his ragged, terrified breathing. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filling up with broken glass, blindly smashing his shoulders against rough bark. The freezing temperature of the deep woods was rapidly sinking into his bones, numbing his fingers and slowing his desperate pace. He knew he could not outrun whatever was dragging itself through the brush, especially without a light to guide him toward the logging road. The heavy, rhythmic thumping started again, but this time it was not behind him. It was echoing from the branches directly overhead. He threw himself underneath the massive, rotting root system of an overturned Douglas fir, burying his face in the frozen dirt. He curled his body into the tightest ball possible, clamping his freezing hands over his mouth to muffle his violent, heavy panting. If he made even the slightest noise, he knew that massive, freezing weight would drop right down on top of him. The heavy, crunching footsteps stopped directly above the hollowed-out dirt cavern where Elias was desperately trying to become invisible. Dirt and dried pine needles rained down onto his trembling neck as the massive thing shifted its immense weight on the dead wood above. The horrible, ozone-rich stench of stagnant water flooded the tiny space, making him gag violently behind his numb hands. It began to speak again, but this time it was not mimicking his nervous laughter from the creek. It was perfectly projecting the voice of Ranger Miller, using the exact same bored, tired tone the old man used to greet tourists. The imitation asked him if he needed any help finding his way back to the main highway, the words dripping with a mocking, cruel awareness. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, biting down so hard on his own lip that he tasted warm copper pooling in his mouth. The twisted imitation of the ranger kept repeating the same friendly question over and over for what felt like hours. Elias dug his fingernails into the frozen soil, fighting every single primal urge in his body to scream out and run. He understood now why the official reports always blamed exposure and panic for the missing hikers they never managed to find. The forest uses your own mind against you, wearing familiar voices like cheap masks to drag you out of your hiding spot. He stayed paralyzed in the dirt, completely giving up any romantic notion of conquering the great, wild outdoors. He was just a tiny, terrified animal hiding in a hole, praying that the apex predator would eventually get bored and wander away. Eventually, the heavy weight shifted off the rotting log, and the wet, dragging footsteps slowly faded back into the impenetrable tree line. Elias did not move a single muscle, even after the oppressive, heavy silence returned to the freezing mountain valley. He lay there trapped under the dead roots, shivering violently as the temperature continued to plummet toward the freezing point. He knew that if he crawled out before the sun came up, that thing would be waiting for him just beyond the tree line. His body was shutting down from the extreme cold, his extremities burning with frostbite, but the pure terror kept his heart hammering. Every rustle of a dead leaf or snap of a twig sounded exactly like a heavy boot pressing down into the dirt. He had survived the immediate, violent encounter, but the night was still incredibly long, and he was miles away from his car. The only thing keeping him tethered to sanity was the tiny, desperate hope of seeing the first gray light of morning through the trees. The first pale streaks of morning light did not bring any real warmth, but they finally broke the suffocating darkness of the timber. Elias stayed buried under the rotting root system for another full hour, terrified that the dawn was just another twisted trick. His entire body was locked in a violent, uncontrollable shiver, his wet clothes frozen stiff against his bruised skin. The normal sounds of the forest slowly started to return, the tentative chirping of small birds replacing the heavy, crushing silence. He carefully pushed the frozen dirt away from his face, half expecting to see that massive, wet shape waiting for him. The woods looked completely ordinary again, a beautiful, sunlit landscape that completely hid the nightmare he had just survived. Pulling himself out from under the dead tree was an agonizing process, his joints screaming in pain from the severe cold. His expensive wool sweater was shredded, his hands were bleeding sluggishly, and his boots were completely soaked through with icy mud. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could look down and see the absolute ruin of his carefully planned campsite. The expensive nylon tent was not just torn open, it was violently flattened into the dirt as if a boulder had rolled over it. His heavy canvas pack and all his gear were gone, dragged away into the deep brush, leaving wide, muddy trenches behind. He did not dare go back down to look for his car keys, knowing that the clearing was now permanently tainted ground. The hike back to the main logging road felt entirely different than his arrogant, confident trek up the mountain yesterday. Every single snapping twig or rustling bush made his heart slam violently against his ribs, sending fresh panic through his exhausted veins. He walked right down the middle of the rough dirt trail, refusing to let the shadows of the tall pines touch him. The beautiful, untouched wilderness he had craved so desperately in the city now just looked like a massive green cage. He constantly checked his own back, convinced he could still smell that vile, stagnant water lingering just underneath the scent of pine. The sun was fully up and blindingly bright, but the lingering cold of that thing's presence still felt burned into his bones. He walked for 3 agonizing hours before he finally heard the low, mechanical rumble of a heavy diesel engine approaching. A pale green forestry department truck slowly rounded the bend, kicking up a massive cloud of dry dust in its wake. Elias stumbled out into the middle of the dirt road, waving his bloody hands frantically until the heavy vehicle ground to a halt. The driver rolled down the window, revealing the weathered, entirely unsurprised face of Ranger Miller, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. The old man did not ask what had happened to Elias's missing gear, his torn clothes, or why his face was covered in dirt. He simply unlocked the passenger door, staring out at the tree line with a completely blank, hollow expression on his face. The ride down the winding mountain road was spent in an agonizing, heavy silence that spoke volumes about what the ranger knew. Miller kept his eyes locked strictly on the dirt road ahead, casually sipping his terrible coffee, as if picking up traumatized hikers was a morning routine. He finally pulled over near the edge of the state highway, pointing a calloused finger toward a small-town gas station. Before Elias could even open the door, the old man handed him a blank clipboard with a thick, heavily redacted non-disclosure agreement clipped to it. Miller told him quietly that if he ever wanted to get his car towed out of the reserve, he needed to sign on the bottom line. He explicitly warned Elias to tell the local police he got turned around in the dark and to never, ever mention the missing wildlife. Elias lives in a brightly lit, obnoxiously loud apartment right in the very center of downtown Seattle now. He refuses to go anywhere near a city park, and the mere smell of pine needles is enough to trigger a violent panic attack. He knows exactly what the locals and the park rangers are hiding behind those locked metal filing cabinets and heavily guarded curfew hours. They are not protecting the delicate ecosystem from careless tourists. They are feeding the woods just enough to keep whatever is out there satisfied. You can try to run away from the noise of the modern world, but you might just find out why our ancestors built walls in the first place. The next time you feel the overwhelming urge to sleep out under the stars alone, just remember what is waiting for you in the total dark.